Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everybody. Always a pleasure to be here. I want to talk tonight about a topic that we've talked about before, I think, but it's always good to revisit. And that is really what I call kind of healthy and unhealthy validation. I think a lot of us walk through life not really being able to feel very good about ourselves or really validate ourselves. And we learn early on to kind of seek elsewhere, seek things outside of us to make us feel good about ourselves. And this really sets the stage for addiction and the blossoming of a really bad addictive disorder. One of the primary tasks, I think, in recovery for any addict is to learn how to kind of do that shift from relying on external sources to tell us that we're okay or feel that we're okay versus being able to do that for ourselves inside. And that's a big shift because this is not reclaiming something we used to be able to do. Most of us have never done that. And so to be able to, these are new skills basically that are learned. But before I get to some of those specifics, I want to talk just kind of a little bit of background on this. I think sometimes, we talk about at Seek Integrity, we often with our check-in in the morning groups, we do ask people to identify dependency needs. And dependency need is something as a child that we're unable to provide for ourselves. So that would be shelter, food, security, hugs, all that stuff, that self-care stuff. When we don't get that consistently as a kid, we learn to cope, we learn to survive, we learn to adapt. And a lot of those adaptations are kind of putting our own needs aside, or if we can even identify what those are, often learning to people please, learning to know that we're not getting any reinforcement that we are okay from our caregivers. So we learn to sort of seek it outside. And very often this is in the form because so many kids who go on to become sex addicts or even partners with sex addicts often have abuse issues going on, particularly sexual abuse. Kids get sexualized. And so a very common trajectory we see is that kids start to see their value in terms of being sexual beings. And obviously no kid should see themselves as a sexual being in that regard. So we get this hurt, we get this invalidation that really creates this inner core that we're not okay. And we need to do more to make ourselves okay. And so there's this idea of a false self that we create, not even intentionally, but maybe I become, the best little boy in the world, or I become the perfect student to make my parents proud. Or sometimes we do the reverse. I become kind of a little bit of an outcast, an outlaw, a rebel. But we find other ways to kind of get validation. But all of it is starting to seek validation on the outside because we don't feel very good about ourselves. We may have core beliefs like I feel unworthy, or I feel unlovable, or I feel unsafe. So all those things start to be compensated for to help us survive, literally. And so when we get this approval, it feels good. And so very often we see, I do a lot of work with gay guys, and we'll see them going to the gym, and then they have a lot of internalized homophobia, a lot of shame about who they are. But what do they do to counteract that? They build up their bodies and they look great. But the problem with that, or they get a real high income job, or you drive a fancy German import car, or whatever it is, to kind of have people go, ooh, nah, he must be okay, that guy. And what happens though, we get a lot of validation from the world for all these things we do and these externals, but none of it really filters in on the inside, because on the inside, we know that we're still not okay. And all this praise and validation, and this now happened, by the way, has moved into the social media realm. So it's now all likes and shares and all the kind of stuff we see in social media as means of getting validation. As we construct our kind of perfectly curated lives in pictures on Instagram, we get that validation. But part of us thinks, well, that's not really a totally accurate picture of my life. I do have warts and other kinds of unpleasantries that we don't usually share on Instagram. So it's not quite real. So the task in recovery basically is to learn how to evaluate ourselves, learn how to get a more realistic view of who we are, of our strengths, and of our character defects, to use a expression from 12-step program. But actually, the big shift that we need to concentrate on is moving from our source of self-esteem from outside of us to inside of us. And that involves, it sounds easy, but it involves a lot of steps. It involves changing some of those core beliefs. If I believe that I'm unworthy or unlovable, it's going to be really hard for me to kind of feel okay about myself. So there's some corrective therapy, I guess, that has to take place. But ultimately, here's some kind of guidelines that I think we shoot for in terms of what I call healthy validation. Now, this is the way it kind of should work. We don't rely on others to validate our existence or define us. And I think a lot of us molded ourselves to become or be what other people wanted us to be. And I think that really, at some point, was a real chasm between our true selves and whatever we become. So I think really to go back and say, am I doing what I want to do? Is this who I am? And by the way, I think everybody in recovery finds that the choices they make in recovery are probably not the same as they made in their addiction, right? Even relationships and partners and jobs and a lot of stuff we do when we're not in recovery are maybe not the same choices. Some of those we live with, some of those we heal, some of those we make changes for. But I think the idea is that we don't rely on anybody else to validate who we are. We feel increasingly more connected with ourselves. This is a huge blessing, I think, in recovery, is that when I came into recovery, I was so disconnected. I had no idea who I was. Almost by design, I disconnected from my inner self because I didn't like that person very much. And I think over time, I began to get to know who I was and admire kind of the fact that I survived certain instincts and things like that. And so I began to have more respect for myself, I guess, and get to know myself. So there's this a period of time where we have to kind of reacquaint ourselves with who we are or learn. And oftentimes that can be really useful, I think, in the context of inner child work or internal family systems work, which talk about kind of parts of us. It's a great way to conceptualize some of that. The other thing too, as we move into recovery, we start to feel more okay about ourselves. So we become more able to tolerate criticism or negative feedback or people maybe just not liking us, and I think if we're okay with ourselves, we're far less concerned about people pleasing or wanting that person to really like us or being really upset that they don't like us and all that external stuff. So if I'm okay with me, I need to be okay with me, right? So I think that's one of the keys that in recovery, we just couldn't tolerate that kind of criticism sometimes. We couldn't tolerate, I often see this in relationships. Couples sometimes have a hard time tolerating disagreement. And that's something I think in a healthy relationship, they can bend a little bit. You can do healthy disagreement. You don't have to be on the same page all the time. And a good, healthy relationship can kind of bend with that. And, I know that if I have a fight with my partner, we're not going to get divorced tomorrow, right? We can tolerate that kind of discussion. So I think that's important. Some other kind of miracles happen. If we're feeling okay about ourselves, it becomes much easier to step out of our comfort zone, right? We can take chances. We might be able to really speak up with our opinion or venture an opinion. Or sometimes I think in creative processes, people are afraid to share because they are afraid they might have some shame or be afraid to share an idea. All those things start to change. We feel okay about ourselves and we're able to sort of participate more fully in whatever it is around us that we do. And then a couple other changes happen. We can start to slowly let go of some of our old survival mechanisms that were built and constructed to keep us safe in some dysfunctional world, right? And so maybe it's the people pleasing, maybe it's the withdrawal, maybe it's the dissociating into fantasy, maybe it's acting out to avoid feelings of not being able to be intimate with the person we really love. Whatever it is, we can start to correct some of those behaviors and let go of those old mechanisms because they no longer serve us. And we can start to design new ways of communicating. We can just in terms of the couples we've been talking about, we can do daily check-ins, we can process feelings, we can really start to incorporate honesty in a timely manner into our relationship. And things like a formal disclosure are really effective ways of kind of processing that stuff and healing the relationship. So basically we can sort of slowly let go of those old survival mechanisms that really don't work so much anymore. And in fact, quite the opposite. They will drag us down in our recovery if we're not careful. Then two more things, right? We can really start to make better choices. If I really know what I want and how I feel about stuff, and I'm not so confused in the swirl of like, well, Scott likes that, so maybe I should like that too. And I start to question what I like, and it just gets all kind of this swirl of confusion. But if I get clarity, I start to make better choices and actually be better friends and better companions and better therapists in my case, I think. And finally, and this is the huge gift, and this isn't maybe in the language of the promises per se, but I think it should be the fact that we feel that we are enough. And I think so many of us in our addiction and early recovery particularly had this kind of belief that I can do all these things, but at some level, I'm just not enough. And I think that starts to correct itself in a way that's a huge gift for us and for people around us. So I really take a look at how you might depend on validation from outside yourself versus the balance of how much you get from inside, and see if you can sort of gradually become less reliant on other people telling you you're okay versus you feeling it yourself. I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Scott.
David, great topic as always. I remember, if you had asked me when I was deep in my addiction, which was for a very long time, do you have good self-esteem? I would have said, of course, I don't need, and what a lie. I really needed the pat on the back from someone else. And if I didn't get it, I would get angry about it. I would get depressed about it. I would drink and use and act out over it because it triggered all of my shame. And I never reality checked anything. I just expected that you would recognize that I deserve the pat on the back. And then if I didn't get it, I think, oh, well, I guess I don't. Self-esteem is a consistent, I think. Whereas, like internally generated esteem is a consistent, whereas this external, need or this external validation, it comes and goes. And
it's very fickle.
Yeah. And it can really mess with our minds. I mean, 1 minute we're on top of the world, and next minute we're the worst thing ever. And again, it just feeds, all of our early life wounding, the trauma, the shame, all of that stuff that you talked about right at the beginning. And what I found was I would really try to control and manipulate others into giving me the validation that I needed or that I wanted, rather than finding it within myself. And what other people think of me is none of my business, really. And that was a hard thing for me to accept, was, what other people think of me is what they think of me. What I think of me is a lot more important.
Right.
But that was
if
not
we don't
the way
like ourselves very much as addicts, we're so dependent on somebody out there telling us we're okay, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was literally told, I was told as a child, what other people think of you is way more important than how you're feeling.
Wow.
Wow. And I mean, I was specifically told that, what other people think of you is very, very important. Much more important than what you think of you, because that's how my mother was raised, and that's what she taught me.
Right.
And it didn't work very well for me. So thank you for hitting this topic. We have some questions left from last week. We've got a couple questions in the Q&A. So type your questions in. We'll get through as many as we can. I'll start with the ones left over from last week. So this first question, my husband of 42 years left Seeking Integrity Los Angeles 5 weeks ago. He's been a workaholic all his life, as well as a sex addict. Through the bad decisions and financial deceptions he has made in the last few years, we are now losing his business of 35 years. He is seeing a CSAT twice a week, attending meetings. He's in Eddie Caparucci's online work group. But she says this betrayed partner says he's backsliding before my eyes. He got hammered, that he's drunk, I assume, Saturday night to top off being very abusive lately. I had to ask him to leave the house. Help, any suggestions? So this is somebody in very early recovery, got some good help from us, but now the business is failing and going away, and he's backsliding in his behavior. We don't know if he's backsliding in his sexual behavior, but he's drinking and he's being abusive.
Right. So, boy, I'm sorry to hear this. This is a bad situation. In early recovery, I think we're all very fragile, and to have, major disaster, I guess I'd call it, like that, a long-term business fail or go down is crushing. And I do believe that in early recovery, we're fragile, right? And we're fragile and can easily be overwhelmed. Our capacity to deal with stuff can be overwhelmed. And it's like this kind of, it just got the sense that this guy was swamped by life at those circumstances. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that slipping down into the path of addiction is inevitable, right? I think there's, and I don't know, Scott had some good questions there. I hear the drinking, I don't know about the sexual behavior, I hear the abusive behavior. All those things are kind of signs and symptoms of somebody in real distress, obviously, right? Blaming and being angry and checking out. And certainly it's a getting drunk or any kind of mood altering drug is as dangerous as a sexual relapse, and it may not be by definition a sexual relapse yet, but that is certainly in the cards if there's not some interruption. So I think I'm a little concerned. I know this question is now a week old. I don't know what's happened here, but my hope is that this person would engage his CSAT and maybe up his level of intervention. That might be increasing therapy to several times a week. It might be getting to some IOP or an intensive outpatient program or some kind of structured weekly group. I mean, he needs to be doing more. That's kind of the easy logic in a case like this. When we're having problems, if it's not working at the current level of intervention, we have to start adding interventionists to it. And by that, I would increase the intensity of the number of therapies getting in intensive outpatient groups, whatever he can do to kind of get back on track. You didn't mention if he's actively connected with other people, other peers, and that's going to be really important too, because I think what happens in situations like this, there's no doubt a lot of shame about this, and I think people tend to pull in and start to isolate and cut off the support at the exact time they need it most. So I would encourage him to kind of beef up whatever he's doing to interrupt the cycle, because I guarantee the cycle will only get worse if it's not interrupted, and to take it from there. And if need be, to kind of keep going into more kinds of support systems. We very often we will recommend somebody going from our place to 4 or 6 or 8 weeks somewhere in a more residential structure where they can continue the work, and maybe they need something like that. So there's all kinds of options, and I think we could probably help you maybe design some of that if you want some consultation on that.
Yeah, and hopefully we have alumni groups for treatment center alums twice a week now, I believe.
Two formal, and then there's a third kind of client run. So there's three a week.
So a lot of guys, when they get out of treatment, whether it's a few weeks or a few months or even a few years, they attend this group regularly, so they have a built-in support network of people who have kind of the same information they do, and they can get it out and get some advice and get kind of talked off the ledge a little bit, because life does continue to happen. Just because we get sober doesn't mean everything smells like roses. It doesn't. Things happen. Businesses go under. And can you talk about that part, David? Since we're talking about external and internal validation, can you talk about that part and why it's so important to have this internal validation and strong sense of self at a time like this?
Exactly. And it's really kind of a perfect example, because especially with business, and we know with male sex addicts particularly, there's a real logical connection with work as a source of validation and external validation. And work provides sometimes it fulfills that craving for intensity and sensation seeking that a lot of sex addicts have, but it also is a huge source of validation. It's a socially rewarding thing. If I'm working 80 hours a week, chances are a lot of people are saying, boy, he works hard. That's dysfunctional. That really, any addict needs to kind of control the amount of work they're doing in recovery. So in a weird way, our society rewards that kind of external validation. And there's money, which is a number, and we can start to look at that. And so a lot of our ego, a lot of our sense of, am I okay or not, gets connected to this thing, which in this case is a business. And if the business is failing, what does that say about me? And that direct connection between something on the outside and my heart and soul. And so I think that's where this need for stronger sense of who I am regardless of the business, right? Regardless of circumstances on the outside, I'm okay. That I'm lovable. I'm working my program. I'm a good person, and whatever kind of beliefs we need to correct to know that we're okay no matter what. Now that in the best of circumstances with something as personal as a business, that's tough. For 20 years down the road in recovery. For new recovery, that's a hard challenge. So all the more reason to get as much support as you can. But as it's actually a perfect example for tonight's topic, because the goal here is to shift some of that am I okay or not logic to how am I feeling inside versus what are the circumstances of my life on the outside, basically.
Yeah, thank you, David. Next question here, 18 months sober from porn and sex addiction. But I have yet to find meaningful outer circle behaviors that do not involve work or caregiving to my betrayed spouse, who is still extremely ambivalent and down. We are 6 months after full disclosure. We're seeing a PAC, which I believe is a pastoral counselor, and I'm in a group with the CSAT, which is a certified sex addiction therapy. In short, I have no hobbies besides recovery activities, and my spouse doesn't want to move on and have fun together, which I get. Joy is missing. Thoughts. Let me explain what circle plans are real quick, David, just to catch people up. With sex addiction sobriety, we have what we call a 3-circle plan. There's an inner circle, which I also call the red light circle, which is my bottom line behaviors. It defines my sobriety if I engage in any of these behaviors. If I look at porn again, I'm not sober. Then we have the middle circle, or I call it the yellow light circle now, which is slippery stuff, thoughts, feelings, people, places, things, events that could slide me back into the red circle. And then we have the outer circle, or the green light circle, which is healthy behaviors we can engage in other than including recovery, but other things that also bring us joy. So instead of acting out, we have a list of things we can do. And I always think that the green circle is the most important of the 3 circles. I carried my circle plan around with me for the first 2 years of my recovery. This was long enough ago that we didn't have cell phones. So I had it printed out on a tiny little piece of paper, and I didn't need to carry it around to remember what I couldn't do or what I was slippery doing. I needed it to remember what I could do instead. But luckily I had a therapist who was very clear about your outer circle, the green light circle, needs to have more than just meetings and work groups and recovery in it. Otherwise, you're going to burn out. And so I had to add some hobbies and some green light stuff to my life. Okay, question on to you, David. The joy is missing. Thoughts?
Yeah, so this is interesting, because I think a lot of us, I was talking in the beginning tonight about what can go wrong in childhood, right? With trauma and neglect and inconsistent caregiver support and just irregular, what we call adverse childhood experiences. And so those can really set the pattern. And many people who grow up to become addicts, I think myself included, frankly, had a real struggle learning how to have fun. I didn't have fun as a kid. I didn't know how to have fun. Life was serious. Life was kind of more than that. It was living with active alcoholics and in a crazy household. And so I never really learned those skills. And so in recovery, I had to start learning how to kind of sit down and relax and not be kind of hypervigilant and focused all the time, and just learn how to have a little bit of fun and connect with people. It's a challenge, and it's still a challenge. So I understand the need, and it may be a new experience. And I would really encourage you to keep trying that. That said, there's a couple other things I want to mention. I was talking to our clients just today about the concept of anhedonia. Anhedonia means an inability to experience pleasure. And it is not uncommon in early sex addiction recovery. Now, I think you said 6 months, and that's already a little long for anhedonia. But in the first couple of months of recovery, because sex and porn addiction kind of hijack our brains, and we become used to that high level of intensity and stimulation, when we stop doing that acting out behavior, our brains have already adapted to that high level. And so it takes usually a couple of months to kind of come back, or we can find pleasure in stuff that used to give us pleasure, like our families or sports we used to like, or music, or whatever, food. So I think there's a period of adjustment when at first in early recovery, things just don't seem as sparkly as they used to be, and that does change. So there's that, but I think you statistically are kind of past that at this point. Another idea I had, I don't know where you're at with this, but when I have seen clients who had a hard time moving into some kind of fun, I always do a screening for some kind of depressive disorder. And I don't know where you're at with that, but major depression can, or even a dysthymic disorder, which is kind of a light depression that's long-term, that can really impact one's ability to enjoy life in that regard. So you might just have a talk with your therapist at first, and then maybe get a referral if need be, but there may be something else going on that's keeping this from happening for you. But all that said, I think I would still continue working on trying to learn stuff and create stuff, and ideally to do things with your partner or wife if you can, because I think a lot of the healing aspects of those outer circle behaviors are when we can start to incorporate doing them with people we love and care about, and in relationships that we're trying to make better. So if you can do stuff together, great, but I would just practice on trying to find even 15 minutes of trying to find pleasure in something, and keep experimenting. And maybe something you haven't tried yet. I had to get very inventive and open my take chances, right? And so it turned out that I love to kayak, and who knew? I'd never kayaked before, but I was invited, and I almost said no like 3 times, and I went, and I love it. So things like that you may not even know yet. So be open.
Yeah. This book here, which I think we can see, Sex Addiction 101, the workbook. This is, it has all the exercises we use in the online work groups for sex addicts, but you can also buy this off of Amazon as a standalone. It has 24 exercises in there that help with sex addiction recovery. The 4th exercise in the book is to create your circle plan. And the very last exercise in the book is called From Shame to Grace. And it's about revisiting the circle plan and adding to the green light outer circle, because it's so important that when Rob and I were putting this book together, we wanted that in there. We wanted people to, get themselves set up and moving in recovery, and then revisit the circle plan, not the red light and the yellow light, but the green light, the healthy stuff, because it's that important. Without that, recovery becomes a drag. And it's hard to stay motivated. So yeah, please add to your circle. Okay, one more from last week. I'm working on, this is from a betrayed partners. I'm working on my boundaries, and I'm confused about slips and relapses. Could you clarify the difference between a slip and a relapse? And should either of them be allowed or overlooked? Am I being too strict and putting strong boundaries around these? Right now, I feel I will end the relationship if he slips or relapses. Is this too optimistic? Is it impossible that he'll never have a slip or a relapse? And maybe you can also address, in addition to sexual behavior slip relapses, secrets and lies relapses, which tend to be ultimately more painful for betrayed partners. So if you can, that's a lot that I just threw at you, sorry.
Yeah. So slips and relapses, I think it's a little bit tricky. My first recovery was from alcohol and drugs, and so I think it's less clear because a slip is a relapse basically. But I think in the sex addiction world, because of behavior and because of the nature of fantasy, and it's a little bit less concrete. And I think my definition of it is a slip is in a single short-term incident. Hopefully it's something that is a bad behavior, obviously, but something that you can kind of self-correct and get back on track and see what just happened. When those slips kind of get sustained over a period of time, it becomes a relapse, right? That's when the whole thing kind of cascades and takes on a life of its own, and then the person is really off and running. I think it's useful to divide those two with sex and porn addiction, because what often happens, and we're talking about the circle plan and how that's tailored to individuals, right? Of what's in that middle circle may change from person to person. But what's in there is really important to take a look at. And I think it's this weird spot that I find myself in with not wanting to encourage relapses, but also not wanting to shame them, especially slips, because I think it's probably, I won't say inevitable, but it's probably not unusual at all to have people have to bounce along the bottom a couple of times on their way to recovery. And then that may mean, in terms of dropping in a fantasy briefly, it may mean some other kinds of behaviors. I hope it doesn't mean actually going out and acting out somewhere. That's a kind of much more serious thing than I think of as a slip sometimes. But anyway, it's dipping into this down a slippery slope of addictive behavior. And the idea of a slip is to like, okay, wow, this just happened. You catch yourself and you kind of come back and you deal with it with your therapist, with your sponsor, and ultimately with your partner, and talk about it as soon as possible, right? Clean it up and stop the process. When we talk about specific behaviors like lies, we've talked about on this webinar before about lying. Basically, I think it's just sad but true that addicts lie, and I think most of us, and going back to, I don't know, overdwell on our disturbed childhoods, but I think a lot of us learn how to lie early on just to cover stuff because it's dangerous. It's a dangerous place to be in that household we grew up in, and lying often, by the way, is a way to deal with shame. If you really knew what I was thinking or doing, I wouldn't be validated or approved. So I'm going to kind of cover my butt here and say something that's not true. So this is a habit, and I think I've heard many addicts express that. I don't even know why I said that. I said something that was a lie, but I didn't even have to lie. It's like stupid. Why did it just came out automatically? And so because of this kind of automatic lying, that, by the way, does improve with recovery, that kind of gradually fades away. But I think what we don't want to do, what I personally believe we don't want to do, is put lying in that inner circle, because it's going to happen. And it may be lying about stupid stuff. And honestly, if we start seeing patterns of deception and lying and cover-ups and all that stuff that makes a betrayed partner kind of go wide-eyed and with good reason, right? But I think sometimes these things happen, and I think we don't want to see people start their day count over again because they said something. Now, what we do demand in recovery is that once you do lie, you got to come clean about it, right? And we talk about coming cleaner sooner. And what I normally ask my people to do is talk to their therapist, talk to their clients, and then talk to their partner once they process it and can explain what happened and what they're going to do about it. So I think that's my take on lying. I think it's just a tricky thing to put in that red circle. I would put it in that yellow middle circle for me. Scott, I'm dying to hear what you think about all this.
Yeah, you just hit on the point that I was hoping you would hit on, which is, if you slip or relapse, if you slip, hopefully not relapse, because relapse is sort of the extended version. You come clean about it right away. You tell your therapist, you tell your sponsor, and you tell your partner, in that order, usually. Well, maybe the sponsor, then the therapist, then the partner. Right. If you're not going to see your therapist for 3 weeks, change the order up. But if you can get all of them within 24 hours or so, do the sponsor and therapist first, and then get to the partner, because they will coach you on, how to come clean, and they'll make sure you actually do it. And the reason I brought that up is, if I slip and don't tell you and just keep it secret, you will eventually find out.
Yeah. And
the longer it takes you to hear about it, the worse your pain is going to be when you do hear about it. That's number one. And number two, if I come clean and say, honey, I need to tell you something. This happened yesterday. Here's what I'm going to do about it. I've talked to my therapist. I've talked to my sponsor. I'm really working on this. That's a big difference for the betrayed partner than finding out on their own, because the neighbor tells them, or because they find something on your phone. If I screw up and come clean, that actually helps me rebuild trust, because I'm telling you something that I don't want to tell you. If I make you learn about it the hard way, that does not help rebuild trust.
Right.
Slips and relapses are not inevitable, but as David said, with sex addicts, they're fairly common, particularly slips. as long as we learn from them, as long as we don't hide them, they're not the end of the world, and relationships can recover. But if I'm still hiding things from you, that makes it just a million times harder for the relationship to recover. So,
And I know it's probably hard for partners to hear because they want not to have
yeah.
to worry about
Oh,
a
yeah.
slip or a relapse, obviously. But I think just to be, it's unrealistic to set a goal of never a relapse or never a slip. Do we want to see that? No. But I think what the important thing is, just to underscore what Scott just said, is,
Yeah.
okay, how do I handle it? What do we do to process it? How can we move past this and move forward and move further into our recovery? So it's all about how we handle it as opposed to the event itself. Hopefully the event itself won't happen, but statistically it probably will. And so you have to figure out, what am I going to do with that? Now, that said, the partner has to, keep their boundaries clear too.
Right.
And it may be that, okay, I think it's unrealistic to say it's over after one slip, but if there's a pattern of slips, if this keeps
Yeah.
happening, then that's serious and needs, that may be a boundary that requires more serious action in terms of that relationship.
Yeah, at some point the pain might be more than you want to sit through. And I do want to reiterate, neither David nor I are saying slips and relapses are okay. They're not. They are counterproductive in 100 different ways, and they're very, very, very painful for the betrayed partner. We are not giving anyone permission to slip or relapse.
Right.
We're not. But we've been around long enough to know that slips tend to happen. So unfortunately. Next question here. How do you shift your focus from sex as performance to real intimacy? How, as an addict, can you work with your partner on this? Interesting question.
Yeah. We are so, when we talk about sex in general, even outside the world of sex addiction, generally there's a viewpoint on performance and orgasm, particularly as what sex is, right? And I think we really need to broaden that definition. And I think, frankly, a lot of that has been really distorted by pornography as people, especially younger people who have never had any other sexual experience, see what porn is and think, okay, that's sex. And they try to do that. And just porn is very destructive in all kinds of ways, but that's another one in which it's done damage. So I think it is important to move from this idea of performance to intimacy. And I think another thing that we see that in this regard that's confusing for sex addicts particularly is this mistaken conflation between intensity and intimacy. If it's intense, if it's performative, as in this question, then it's somehow intimate. We know those two things don't equate. Intimacy is about vulnerability, it's about trust, it's about communication, and it's about far more than just performance, right? I have found, frankly, and there's a lot of research on this, as people get older, performance is not as important as, guess what's important? Touch. Touch is like the forgotten element of intimacy here, that there's something much more erotic and intimate about holding each other than getting into some wild, gymnastic performance thing. So I think building that ability to be vulnerable, building on that ability to learn to trust one another, which takes time with all the damage that can happen with sex addiction, but really focusing on those and starting to connect. And I think very often a great way to connect is start to reframe intimacy out of this like intensity performance thing into more of a like, let's connect at a physical level. And that means touch. It may develop into sexual contact or other kinds of sexual things, but I think take it slow and approach it in a different way. I have found, I'm a sex therapist, when we rely on intensity and fantasy to drive our sexual performance, every sex addict can tell you, you hit a ceiling. Eventually, there's not enough stimulation in the world to keep that going. But what we've forgotten in that equation is that our bodies are hardwired to respond, and they respond to touch and to other sensations. And so I think if we can rediscover these other ways of connecting with each other, it's really powerful. I have mentioned this probably every week. I'll do it again. The Masters and Johnson exercise called Sensate Focus is designed for just this. It's a way for couples to get reacquainted at an intimate level, and it's a touch exercise, give and take, touch and communication. So things like that. There are steps out there, but I think I would take it slow and just try to work on other ways besides just the intensity and the performance.
I just popped a link to an article that Dr. Rob just published with Psychology Today about sexual narcissism. And one of the traits of a sexual narcissist is that they seem to perform during sex, like they're going to get a standing ovation.
That's that external validation thing I was talking about.
Yes, thank you, external validation.
Yeah.
And being a sexual narcissist does not necessarily mean you have narcissistic personality disorder. It just means you seek a lot of external validation through sex. Interesting article for those who are interested. How do you not regret poor one-way decisions you have made in addiction in recovery? I'm not sure if the poor decisions were made during the addiction or during recovery. Maybe address both, David.
Yeah, so I think, boy, I think most addicts have a colorful history of bad decisions. I certainly did. So I think, and by the way, like Scott said, life continues in recovery, right? And so did some bad decisions sometimes. We're not magically transformed. So those things happen. I think when we make the decisions, I think like relative to the conversation we just had about a slip, I think these are things that are good to take a look at, good to have some insight about, good to check out with trusted advisors, and really see what we can learn from it. I think to most of us, well, a lot of us with dysfunctional kinds of behaviors coming into recovery will take a mistake or a poor decision and really beat ourselves up. We know how to do that. We know how to dive into shame, do that shame spiral down into the depths and berate ourselves, and all that negative self-talk, that critic that's always talking in our ear is going to start to undermine us. And it can be a real setup for a relapse, frankly, because when we get into that negative space, what do? We want to just check out. And how do we check out? We go to our addiction. And so it's a dangerous kind of slippery slope. So I'd really try to get some perspective on that decision as best you can, and it may be the best you can do in that regard is to take a look at it and say, okay, what could I have done better? Or where did I go off the rails on this one? But I would really try to lighten up on yourself. There's one of the aspects of mindfulness is just noticing without judgment. And I think if we can really look at our actions where there's been a mistake that we identify and really kind of look at it with non-judgmental eyes and try to learn from it, I think that's really a good outcome from a situation like that, just to avoid repeating that behavior next time around. So.
Next question here. How do you know if your masturbation 2 to 3 minutes without fantasy/porn is acting out? I understand that intention matters, and you can ask yourself if you are hungry, angry, lonely, tired. In other words, I'm zoning out. But I just can't trust the addict in me, and I sometimes regret masturbating later. If masturbation was in my middle circle, which is the slippery circle, then I won't have to reset my sobriety clock every 2 to 3 weeks. Can it be moved from the inner red light circle to the middle yellow light circle if we can define what healthy masturbation is? So is there such a thing as healthy masturbation? If so, how do we define it? We've had this question before, but it's always worth addressing.
Yeah, and I think, masturbation is not the enemy here, right? It's just what's tricky about masturbation is that it's such a powerful mood changer, and it's so incorporated into our addictive behaviors that it's very easy to just drop into that fantasy space, and even if it's only for 2 or 3 minutes, and it sounds like you've done that as well. And so, I think one of the solutions to that is actually to put masturbation in your inner circle, the red circle, for a while. I know that means a relapse if you slip, but it also means that you can make a commitment to just not going there for a while, and you may or may not be able to do that. But I have found if people can get some space there, it kind of gives some perspective. And then once you do decide, and if there is such a thing, I think there is ultimately, of kind of masturbation that can be with the intention of connecting with yourself, pleasing yourself, feeling good. I mean, all those are fine, right? It's just, I think in early recovery particularly, we addicts particularly have a way of using masturbation or alcohol or cocaine or other kinds of behaviors, food, to dissociate or disconnect from uncomfortable feelings. And you acknowledge that with acknowledging the intention, right? So your intent is good, but I'm not sure you're always accurate maybe in picking the intention if you have some regrets afterwards. I think probably the easiest thing right now is to put it where you're not going to, where you commit to not doing it for a certain period of time. And as with any circle plan element, we just don't move them around willy-nilly. They're readjusted through negotiation with you, your sponsor, your therapist, and so on. So they're not just,
and your partner if there is one.
yeah, exactly. And we just don't decide, well, I'm going to move this around. So, but I think just because you've raised the issue, it seems to be a bit of a problem. It may be worth just putting that away for a while and trying to just kind of distance yourself from it.
Yeah. When we teach the circle plan at Seeking Integrity Los Angeles and in the online work groups for sex addicts and porn addicts, we always say err on the side of caution with masturbation. If you're not sure, put it in the red light circle and keep it there for a while. Revisit it in 6 months, revisit it in a year. You need to get some clarity, and staying away from masturbation helps. And this first sentence, masturbating for 2 to 3 minutes without fantasy porn. I'm sorry, I don't believe you. I don't know anybody who has ever masturbated without some kind of fantasy. You may not be having addiction related fantasies, but I suspect you're having some kind of fantasy there. And there's nothing wrong with that. Part of resetting our arousal template, and this is something that we cover at SILA and in the work groups, is creating healthy fantasies that aren't the addiction superhighway. But if you're struggling at this point and you're not sure, err on the side of caution. Keep it in your red light circle for now. Revisit it later with your therapist and sponsor and spouse, if there is one. By the way, if you're single, we have a support group on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. that I facilitate for single guys. And we talk about masturbation quite a bit. And we also talk about what's in this next question quite a bit. So why don't we jump to the next question? Are there support groups for male sex addicts where we could talk about erectile dysfunction and other sexual issues? Does talking with other men about such issues help with reducing shame? Do you mind if I go first, David?
No, please, go ahead.
Okay. Again, in the single guys group, we talk about masturbation, we talk about ED. A lot of the guys there have what we call porn-induced erectile dysfunction, where they can function sexually with pornography, but not with the real world partner. The second half of that question, and we talk about that fairly often there, we also talk about it in both the sex addiction and porn addiction work groups. It is common for sex addicts to experience erectile dysfunction with real world partners, whatever the acting out behavior, but especially if it's porn. It's common. It's not like occasional, it's common. So we talk about it, and I'll say, who has had erectile dysfunction? If there's 20 guys in the group, 15 of them will raise their hand. And then there are online support groups for male addicts, and the issue comes up at least once in a while in those groups. Somebody will bring it up, and the other guys are so relieved when somebody brings it up, or when I bring it up in the work groups, because they can finally talk about it without shame and know they're not alone. So yeah, does talking with other men help? Yes. Okay, David, yours.
No, I think I agree with everything you said. I think that this is an issue for men that just creates a whole lot of shame and frankly isolation. So to be able to talk about it in a group setting and hear the experience of other men and sort of normalize the experience a little bit, and also not just that, but hear about solutions and what people are doing to help themselves in that regard is hugely beneficial. So I'd encourage you to find formats, whether it's Scott's work group or a place. There's a lot of CSATs run therapy groups for male sex addicts that I think also are very beneficial. I know this topic comes up in those kind of contexts as well. But I think just understanding that this is a normal thing, I could go into much more detail about the anatomy of how an erection happens, but basically sex addiction, it relies on hitting adequate arousal up here. And if sex addiction hijacks to the point where the message never gets sent south, down there to do anything. And even the erectile dysfunction drugs only work if that message arrives from your brain, and it never does with sex addiction. So many times those drugs don't work either. So I think just having that sometimes explained to guys is really helpful, but certainly not as helpful as just being able to talk about it and try to reduce some of the shame that goes with it.
Yeah. And it does tend to abate with sobriety. The brain kind of resets. David, maybe we could do sometime in the next month or two, a webinar where our educational portion is on
Yeah,
this. I think that would be good.
for
So
sure.
I don't think we've done a whole webinar on that.
That'd be great. Easy
yeah,
to do.
yeah. I am a sex addict a year after D-Day. I attended inpatient treatment. I participate in meetings and I have connections. I believe I have a good base and new knowledge, but I just cannot move forward with my self-care, my outer circle, and my needs because shame and guilt are just too present. Any tips? I know who this is, and this was like losing the business. This is another situation where there's a whole lot going on in your life right now, and the shame and guilt are rising to the surface. So when the shame and guilt are rising to the surface, David, what can somebody do to engage in better self-care and more green light outer circle stuff?
Yeah. Shame is such a strong component of most addicts that it's almost always present. And then when certain circumstances happen, it can trigger even more. And we talk about a shame spiral. There's a flood of shame, but shame can be really crippling. And I found that shame can kind of dominate and kind of overshine everything else. And so, we can't think our way out of shame. We can't work it out on our own. To me, the solution for shame is to do exactly what you're doing, which is to talk about it, to express this is what you're feeling, to stay connected with people, to get that feedback. And I believe if we just keep releasing the shame, giving it away, and remember, nobody's born with shame, right? Shame is one of those things that's taught to kids, and it's taught by critical parents or by the church or by laws or by bullies or whatever. We learn that there's certain aspects of ourselves that are just not okay. And after all, we start to believe it and we incorporate it, and it takes on a life of its own. And that's the anatomy of shame. But the solution is to get rid of it. And I think just give it away, give it away, give it away. The other thing I'll just mention, and I'm not a big pill pusher, but you're in one of those circumstances that you certainly qualify for a diagnosis of what I would call adjustment reaction, which is like this critical life event that's just happened and it's kind of rocking your world a little bit. And so I don't know, an antidepressant or look at that might be helpful in this case, because what we know about antidepressants, they kind of keep the floor from dropping out from under us, right? And that in certain circumstances like this might be useful, but more than that, and that might be a nice addition, but I think just really keep doing what you're doing and sharing sharing your lovely heart with people and getting the feedback and receiving the feedback. Because I know it's easy and people are more than willing to come up and express their support. But sometimes if we're in that middle of that shame spiral, it's hard for us to hear it and receive it. And so I think really to concentrate on knowing that you are loved and lovable, and you'll get through this with support of all your friends.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. You'll get through this. It will pass. This too shall pass. The good feelings pass, the bad feelings pass. This too shall pass. Okay. Next question here. This is the betrayed partner of somebody who looks like they took the sex addiction level 1 work group, probably with either me, Jonah, or Jason. This is a healthy masturbation question again. And in the class, my former spouse said that he was told once a week or every once in a while is normal for relieving yourself. I assume that means masturbating, as long as you are not using it as a coping mechanism. Would this be true? I will say, first of all, what we say and what gets heard is not always the same thing. Right. And what gets heard and what gets reported to a betrayed partner is sadly not always the same thing. I'll go ahead and take this first, David.
I was going to say, why do you clarify?
I'm the one who teaches the work groups usually.
Yeah.
We almost always get asked about healthy masturbation. And I will almost always use myself as an example. In 4 days, if things go well, I'll have 20 years sober from sex and porn addiction. I'm single. I have been single the whole time. And for me, masturbation is now, not at the beginning of my recovery, but it is now in my yellow light circle, because frankly, it's my only sex life. And I have rules around it. I do not use it as a coping mechanism. I make sure I'm in a good headspace. Usually I have a little date with myself. I make myself a nice meal and watch a movie I like, and, maybe take a warm bath. I go on a date with myself, and it's a form of self-care. But I have to, I don't let myself have addiction-related fantasies. It's okay to have, I think it's okay for me to have sexual fantasies, as long as they're not addiction fantasies, as long as I'm not traveling that dopamine, adrenaline superhighway. And for me, that is okay. Now, in early recovery, not so much. I was not in a headspace where I could do any of that in a healthy way. I was too close to my addiction. I did not have other healthy coping mechanisms. I just, and I wasn't able to care for myself in that way. So what was said may have been misinterpreted or misspoken to you. I don't know. Masturbation is not the enemy. David said it earlier. It's like alcoholics have to realize alcohol is not the enemy. What I do with alcohol is the enemy.
Right.
And the same is masturbation. If I'm using masturbation in an unhealthy way, meaning for emotional escape, it is not healthy, and I should not be doing it. If I'm using it in a self-care way, for me, it's healthy-ish, maybe. I don't know if it's healthy or slippery, but it's not a bottom line behavior for me at this point. And circle plans change over time. So,
Right.
But that decision, trust me, was not made without consultation with a therapist and a sponsor and a couple of friends in recovery. So, yeah. Okay, David, yours. Sorry.
No, I don't have too much to add to that. I think it's exactly right, because it's in early recovery, and maybe for quite a while, masturbation is something that's just too easily, we jump automatically onto that dopamine superhighway you're talking about, right? The old addictive pathways take over, and it's just, and you don't need to masturbate to, live. Right? It's not a necessary physiological function. And so I think it's far best to err on the side of caution in those circumstances.
Yeah. So, but yeah, and you're saying former spouse, so this person is single. I can understand why he would want to masturbate once in a while. Yeah, probably not at this point in his recovery.
Right. That would be my guess.
And some people, masturbation was never part of the addiction. It was all about affairs, or it was all about getting another person. And for them, masturbation is probably yellow circle right from the start, although it may land in the red circle if it takes off on them, kind of spins out of control.
Right.
There were things that were not in my red light circle in the beginning that are now. The porn world looked very different 20 plus years ago. I had to change my plan when porn changed. So yeah, we're out of time. We got a couple questions left. I will save them for next week. We'll do them first next week. Thank you, David, for a great topic. I invite everyone to pay attention to how much we all, or you, meaning we all, look for external validation, because even today I still want and crave external validation, and then compare that to what internal validation exists, and there's a different feeling with them. So sure. It's really worth paying attention to for a week or two. Anything you want to say to take us out, David?
No, just that. I think just asking people to pay attention is a great step. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the great questions today. We will see you next week.
Thanks, Scott. Bye-bye.